This is the final project for the Interdisciplinary Relationships course at UMass Global. This assignment is to look at a cultural event over the last 50 years and how it affected society. My choice was the counterculture movement that started during the 1950s and 1960s and how it is continuing to affect societal movements today. The United States was coming out of post-World War II society. 1940s was fraught with patriotism, war bonds, war rations, and lists of the dead soldiers from Europe and the Pacific. The Beat generation came from attitudes of young people in the 1950s. The Beats were curious about religion and spiritualities that were foreign to the general population of the United States in the 1950s. This search for spirituality eventually led them to Buddhism. The Beat philosophy was generally countercultural and anti-materialistic and stressed the importance of bettering one's inner self over material possessions. Such beat writers as Gary Schneider began to delve into Eastern religions such as Buddhism and Taoism. They advocated personal release, purification, and illumination through the heightened sensory awareness that might be induced by drugs, jazz, sex, or the disciplines of Zen Buddhism. They believed in using drugs or sex to heighten sensory awareness, believing that it would increase the spiritual awakening. Jack Kerouac was a noted poet of the movement. He had ties to the 1940s communist movement, although officially it was denied as a large part of his life. Allen Ginsberg stated that Jack Kerouac was influenced to some degree by communism. I don't think he read it with any formal scholarship, but I'm sure he read it in and out of Das Kapital and read through the Communist Manifesto and maybe a few other things, and he read the Daily Worker. It was not a phase that lasted very long. It was only 2 or 3 years, stated Ginsberg. While this didn't make Kerouac communist, it did push him more to the center, becoming libertarian in nature, pushing him more to let people govern themselves and keep establishment out of it. Beats often read The Daily Worker, which began publication in 1924. It was published in Chicago by communists, socialists, and union members. Other popular publications were Das Kapital, considered a scientific work by Karl Marx himself. It argued that socialism and communism were stable economic models. Many Beats did not fully see themselves as communist. Part of this was because of the anti-communist tribunals of the 1950s. However, it did move their politics further to the central left than mainstream society of the time. The major distinction between Beats and later movements were that they wanted to push the establishment and government out of daily life as much as possible and believed that people should have the freedom to govern themselves. This would align them more with modern day libertarians. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the Beats and Beatniks gradually gave way to a new kind of counterculture, the hippies, who actually preferred to call themselves freaks or love children. The hippies were much younger than the Beatniks. They could even have been the Beats' children and had a much different view. They were more influenced by Chinese politics than by communist Europe, although they did incorporate both. They increased the belief and usage of drugs and alcohol to heighten the spiritual experience. While Beats had their own communities, they stayed largely within mainstream society as far as where they lived. New ideas spawned an interest in communal living. China's sprawling communes, championed by Chairman Mao Zedong in that era, received global attention and study. Creation of communes allowed them to move further away from mainstream society. They did not try to make areas which attacked normal society. They only wanted to create safe areas to live life as they saw fit without harassment from the outside environment. The U.S. had as many as 3,000 smaller communes of its own during the 1960s and 70s, populated by young idealists in search of an alternate lifestyle. It's hard to establish a hard figure, as many people lived in a group homes but didn't call the arrangement a commune. During this time, Vermont had a large concentration of followers of this movement. Forbes states John Pollock estimated that there were 35,800 hippies in Vermont, who accounted for roughly 33% of the total 107,527 people in the state between the ages of 18 and 34. Communes were early adopters of supporting the homosexual community. Largely at this time, homosexuality was still vilified and kept in the closet in smaller community alcoves. Communes provided an area to be open. One commune claims to have performed the first gay wedding during this time, although it was not a legal marriage. The links to Chinese politics. The links between communes and Chinese politics are worth noting. It will affect both the hippies and later movements going through till today. At the same time that Chairman Mao in China was implementing the Great Leap Forward, these communes were becoming established. It was meant to push the Great Leap Forward was meant to push Chinese society into competing with other superpowers such as the United States and Russia, increase employment, and fix other economic issues they were having. Chinese citizens were forced into communes where their production was closely monitored. The movement would end with widespread starvation among the workers. The general idea of communal living, working together for the communal society, made it to America. It was found fertile soil in the 1960s counterculture movement. It is worth noting that Chairman Mao's goal was to use the commons to move China into socialism and then full-scale communism. These same ideas found it into these U.S. communes, and you can see it as it plays out through today. The United States versus Chinese communes. It is worth looking at how U.S. communes differed from the Chinese ones. They did not have government backing. In fact, the government would come to see them as societal threats and make moves against them. The U.S. communes did have the similarity of the idea was to work together, growing food, caring for children, and household tasks, each person with their job that worked together to help the whole. There were key differences. U.S. communes were not highly organized. There were few rules, and job tasks were not enforced. It was this loose enforcement, if any enforcement, that gave the major distinction. There was no governing body. A gap grew between members. Some did work and adhered to their assigned jobs. Others chose to focus more on sex, drugs, and recreation. Why did they decline? Although American communes worked to raise food, shared parenting and household tasks, shared financial responsibility and upkeep, the rules and organizations were often lax, leading many to fail simply because there was no governing body. Not enough discipline or consequence when someone did not do their part. Also, for some, as we've stated, drugs and sex were more important than work. The end of the Vietnam era, the women's movement, and economic realities were major reasons so many communes broke up. During the mid 1970s, especially after the 1974 to 1975 oil embargo, there was a dramatic spike in the cost of food, fuel, and other necessities. As economic changes made living on next to nothing more difficult, and as many early relationships broke up, many of the young people who had coupled up fell apart. Some moved back to where they had grown up or returned to college to finish degrees or get graduate ones. People with degrees began wanting to use those degrees for both economic and personal reasons. Not all communes died out. The Vermont Commune became a think tank for artists established by Andy Kopkin. Andy Kopkin was a journalist that embraced his persona as a radical journalist. His articles furthered such liberal ideas as problems with the Cold War in the 1980s because it moved against communism in Eastern Europe and bemoaned that the airwaves had hymns and sermons. In later slides, we will look at former counterculture and commune members and where they ended up in society. This movement spawned multiple other protest groups. The Weather Underground was a large movement. It would be attributed with violent attacks such as robberies and bombings. It would also spawn some notable figures, as we will see in the next section. Animal Liberation Front's stated mission is to fight against animal cruelty. They were formed in 1974. Their actions have included attacks on animal testing facilities, freeing lab animals, and other animals seen as wrongfully imprisoned, throwing paint on those wearing fur coats, and other protests. Members state that they are not terrorists because they do not harm people. The Environmental Liberation Front is stated to be a group that takes action to protect the environment. Their actions have included bombings, arsons, and attacks on things seen to be harming the environment, such as a Hummer dealership in California in the early 2000s. Antifa is one of the most recent groups to join the counterculture movement. Their stated mission is to fight against fascism. However, their actions included taking over city blocks of Portland in 2020, from which multiple fires and a couple homicides were the result. Politically, the mainstream media formed this as the Summer of Love and reported these as peaceful protests. We have seen how the counterculture movement of the 1950s grew into the 1960s hippie movement and into the creation of communes. But how did this movement move so far into mainstream society as to not only create further groups, but also to start to change society itself? This can be seen in where its members ended up in society. Patricia Whalen is our first example of where counterculture movement members ended up in society and the influence that they would eventually wield. She was a prominent member of the Weather Underground, was put on trial for murder associated with Weather Underground actions, was later acquitted when it could only be proven that she was a member of the group and at the scene of the actions. She later would finish law school and begin practicing law, would go on to found the Afghan Judicial Education Program, became an advisor to the Center for Peace Building in Bosnia, one of the many achievements that seem interesting for a member of a violent protest group. She eventually would receive several awards, including the Susan J. Herman Award for Leadership in Holocaust and Genocide Awareness. One of the most prominent people produced by the countercultural movement is Senator and former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. It is not hard to see how he was molded by the movement in Vermont. He was a large force of founding the progressive wing of the modern Democratic Party. As a youth, was a member of the Young People's Socialist League in college. Early in his political career, was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Vermont. He even produced a documentary about Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs. Ran for governor as part of the Liberty Union candidate party. As part of that Liberty Union Party, also ran in 1972 and 1974 candidate for Congress. It wasn't until he built himself as an independent that he would win election to Congress. He was the first socialist in Congress since 1948. He would later sponsor bills to control guns, create cancer registries, and many other things. An example of where the movement had become since the belief in limited government and public influence on individuals, leaning towards individuals governing themselves rather than the government telling people what to do. Art Spiegelman is one of our next three examples, illustrate one path that brought the counterculture beliefs into mainstream society that we see today. He would become the professor of aesthetics of comics at School and Visual Arts in New York City, inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame, inducted into the Art Directors Club Hall of Fame. He won a Pulitzer Prize for a graphic novel, spent many years as contributor for The New Yorker, and most notably in 2005 would be named to Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People. Notable for a member of a movement that started out to be against the culture, but would end up one of the country's most influential people. Kathy Boudin is our next example. She continues the examples of Weather Underground members going from violence to academia. She was convicted of murder for Weather Underground bombing, in which multiple people died, including some members. She would be released from prison in 2013. And also, before prison, robbed an armored car with members of both the Communist Organization and Black Liberation Army. After prison, she becomes an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Social Work, training students that would later move into society as social workers. Co-founded the Center for Justice at Columbia University and became a scholar in residence at New York University School of Law. Our last example, Bill Ayers, is another movement member that became very influential in academia. Co-founded the Weather Underground Group. He became a professor at the College of Education at University of Illinois in Chicago. Before becoming a professor, would become the director of the Children's Community School in Chicago. He wrote books on how to teach and won Whitten Award for distinguished work in biography and autobiography. Served as vice president for curriculum for American Educational Research Association, providing him a position to affect the curriculum that would be used to teach students in a very broad way. Became member of the executive committee of the faculty senate at University of Illinois, Chicago. We have seen the beliefs of the counterculture movement and how they grew over the decades. We have seen a few examples of how members moved into prominent positions in society and brought the movement with them. Keep in mind that we only named a few members in this presentation. There were many more examples. It is these actions that would affect society as a whole. In the last section, we will look at how society in the 2020s is still being affected by this movement. Modern day effects of the counterculture movement. Many LGBTQ+ owes its creation to the early actions to bring homosexuality out of the shadows of society that started in the 1960s. The movement to legalize marijuana was also started by members of the 1960s hippie movement. Examples have shown that current large-scale efforts to promote socialism in many college campuses and all levels of education are due to positions of influence held by counterculture movement members. Such modern curriculum movements as critical race theory enjoyed fertile soil in academia because of actions taken by people with direct ties to the 1960s hippie movement. This assignment was to create a presentation that looked at a cultural event over a 50-year period and the effects it had on society. While I considered what event to study, I could find few that had such a large and widespread effect on society as the countercultural movement of the 1950s and 1960s. It is worthy to note that early movement members might be surprised that their counterculture movement would largely become the culture itself. Our last few slides will list all the sources that were used in creation of this presentation, including attributes for the photos used.